Okay, we're going to talk about couture plain seams. You can read all about this in the book. On my book, it begins about page 36. But couture plain seams is a little bit different than maybe ready-to-wear plain seams, meaning that there's a lot of thread marking and basting that happens. And then we also do use the sewing machine, which is exciting. So I guess where to start, and probably the most work, is to mark where your sewing lines are. Usually in couture sewing, you don't line up the raw edge of your fabric on the throat plate and then sew with a designated seam allowance. Usually the seam allowances are too wide or vary for whatever reason. So you really need to mark your sew lines on your fabric. And of course, there's multiple ways to do it. I think the easiest way is maybe to get some chalk paper and place the paper on your fabric and then find your pattern. And this is all a demo sample. Obviously, I would probably be using much larger pieces of fabric, but just so you can see it, I have a little small swatch. And you would place your pattern over the back of the chalk paper, so with the chalk side facing your fabric, and then you would get your rolling wheel, and then you would trace your sew line, and then the chalk should then be on your fabric. Okay. So it might be a little hard to see on the camera, but I can see a little bit of white chalk running along there. Then the next step is to thread mark it. And to do that, you can do an even basting stitch kind of style. Well, let's see here. Basically, you kind of just put your thread in. I did tie the bottom of my knot. And I'm just going to go along and mark my stitch line. So I kind of took about 1/2 inch space, and then I picked up about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to go another 1/2 inch. I'm going to grab 1/8 of an inch, and I am marking my thread lines. So you'll do that on both pieces that get sewn together. What's good about this type of thread marking is you can see it from the front and the back. There we are. So I'll be able to see my stitch line, well, where my stitch line should be on the front side and the back side of the fabric. So to get started for a plain seam, thread mark your 2 fabric pieces, and then you will baste them together. Once your 2 pieces have been thread marked, you can place them right sides together and be sure to line up where the stitching should be. You can use some pins absolutely as well. And then get some thread, and you're going to baste them together. If you read your book, it's going to say to use even basting if it's a seam that needs to be a bit stronger. But if it's like a long, just kind of flowing seam line, you can do uneven basting. I don't really know why there's a difference, because either way, when we're done, we're going to machine sew the seam, and then we're going to take out the basting. So I think for me, I'll just go ahead and do an even basting stitch. So I'll try to make all my stitches and spaces evenly apart. And I'm trying to mind that I am right on my stitching on both sides. You'll have to take a minute and kind of double check that. For me, it's kind of handy to have a needle that's a little bit longer so I can do a few stitches at once. And I did thread tie my knot. I could have also just done a back stitch, a hand back stitch to secure my thread as well. That would have worked too. Okay, there we go. So I have my even basting in, and I'm ready for the next step. Once the seam has been thread traced and it's been basted together, now you can take it to your sewing machine and go ahead and sew a regular stitch. I'm probably going to do it length about 3, and that's the next step. Okay, so I took my little swatch to the sewing machine and I sewed just a straight stitch with about stitch length of 3. I did back stitch, and when I back stitched, I tried to only do 1 little back stitch instead of like 5, like a long one. Cool. So now my plain seam is actually ready to go. So I am ready for the next sewing sample.